It did. But will it run out?
Now we have to listen to you.
Ah. All right. Guess we ought to get going, huh? All right. Well, let's go ahead and we'll get started as people trickle in. I guess in the summer we trickle, so to speak. So, as you recall, last week, as we've been talking about Barton Stone, we were talking about the struggles that they were having in understanding some things and what was going on within the Restoration movement. And one of those topics is we were looking at baptism. And while Stone and the others obviously agreed that baptism was important and to do that, Stone was not as adamant about that if someone was living a life as demonstrated by these fruits of the Spirit, and if they had not been immersed because their conviction that that wasn't the most essential, he was willing to accept them. And so not taking a plus or a minus on that, just making us aware that there was that. And so his thoughts were that how can I condemn others because they don't understand it or didn't understand it as I do now. And so when they were living a life that demonstrated that spirit. Now, it's not that he wasn't for baptizing and shouldn't baptize and so on, but he was not willing to go as far as to condemn those who were following Christ. Yes, Bill.
Do you know enough about him to know whether his relationship with that personal choice was that he wanted to continue to have a relationship with these people that he may, through the word that he's teaching,
Yes.
convince them otherwise and not cause them to rebel?
Well,
that he was being judgmental, he didn't want to be judgmental, it wasn't his place to do that, or what was his real reason for that position?
well, I think we touched on some of that, or we will a little more today. But that's a great question, and I think it's probably both, because he realized. I think I don't know if it was the last time or we're going to do it shortly here, but he wrote down that those that so insisted on that had caused all the other groups to really hate him and cause lots of problems and add to the disunity. And so that was part of it, at least from what he wrote. And then, and I think the other idea that he was, humble about that, and that, remember, Stone put great emphasis on the transformed life and that piety and how one lived, and not just what you believe, meaning the facts and the details and so on. Not that that wasn't important, but he had a lot of emphasis on it. And so, again, it wasn't, he baptized thousands, so it wasn't that, but and so just very interesting, I think, as we look at that. Then the other thing that we touched into was the thought of debates. And as we've talked about before, debate was kind of one of the main ways of doing things out there. And we've mentioned before that it was in the times. It wasn't unique to those in our fellowship at all. And as I said, the Democratization of American Christianity by Nathan Hatch goes into great detail about those times if you want to look in and explore that and that way of doing things. And so he was in debates because he thought that they just made it worse. He thought, yeah, you might have people converted and you might have things like that, but it created such rancor and such division. He was not into that. And so he admitted that debates might win many to a given cause, but he questioned the conviction of those converted in this way. The children are like the parents, lean and pygmy things. In other words, he didn't think that was a way to mature, was through debates. In 1844, near the end of his life, Stone complained that many of his own people increasingly placed Bible knowledge, religious controversy, and debate above godliness, piety, and brotherly love. And so again, it's this different kind of look at it that he's emphasizing. What are the fruits of that knowledge rather than just knowledge? Scott.
So they place those things above brotherly love today.
Well, and Scott pointed out that, and I think we can all recall evidence of that in our own lives and experiences, how can those things be neglected for these other, because it's, the facts are put up as most important, and then it's kind of picking and choosing, instead of how can one be loving and so on. And so there's this contrast that goes on. Do we see genuine Christianity promoted by such controversy and debates? Look around and inquire for these fruits. Do you know anybody spiritually renewed or refreshed with spiritual understanding? Do you find brotherly love and Christian union advanced? On the contrary, do you not find their opposites promoted? And again, all we can think is our contemporary political environment, to see what happens. Who has ever been changed their mind on Facebook because of something somebody posted, thinking that means their position's right? Instead, somebody could post something else the opposite, and we see those wars. And so I think that's kind of what he's struggling with, is that it might make you feel good, it might make you feel empowered to win the debate and so on and so forth, but what's really being accomplished is kind of the way he's coming from. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. He admitted the debates, Steve, am I blocked out? There we go. Finding his strong ecumenical emphasis in Stone has caused many historians, especially within the tradition of the disciples of Christ, to view Stone chiefly as apostle of unity and a harbinger of the modern ecumenical movement. However, Stone's apocalyptic worldview would cause some pause to this conclusion. And of course, we know that the disciples were all from common roots, and the disciples, people on our end would say that's the real liberal wing, and that they sacrificed understanding and doctrine for this purpose of unity no matter what, is how some might phrase it. And so there are those historians there that look to Stone as, hey, look, he was one of us. Well, not necessarily in that sense. Stone would never have approved of this vapid ecumenicism where one group is viewed just as good as another. Quite the contrary, Stone viewed all denominational structures as equally fallen, therefore equally wrong. He just thought whoever's, ours, theirs, whoever's, that particular view. And together they constituted what Stone described as Babylon and a wilderness of confusion. In other words, he was not for them. He allowed that there were authentic Christians within the denominations, but he routinely called them out and abandon Babylon and unite with the New Testament alone. He believed that once all Christians abandoned Babylon, all denominational structures would collapse in the dust. Or so the thinking goes, or the concept. And so he is totally for God, totally for Jesus, totally for following him and not being cluttered up by these other things. In Stone's view, the collapse of denominational structures and the final triumph of primitive Christianity would characterize the millennium. Okay, so these would fall, and this triumph of this primitive Christianity that was what would be in the millennium. Stone's willingness to fellowship with people from a variety of denominations was a measure adapted only to a fallen world. He believed that in the millennium there would be only one true church of Christ. That's talking in a very broad sense, governed by Christ himself. And so these things are what we got in our fallen world, but one day it's just going to be all this one. Scott.
He would have said, and I'm not picking what he did there, he's quoting someone, but he would have said church with a small c, would he not?
He probably would have, but our author put a capital in, so being true to him. Okay, so Scott said he would have, Stone probably would have had that small c on the Church of Christ. Bill.
Heaven will not be segregated.
Yeah.
Heaven will not be segregated. In the spiritual realm, there won't be those that do it this way or those that do it that way, or this flock over here belongs to this belief, this flock over here belongs to this belief.
And so why do we so struggle with that?
And that's not talking about black and white,
No.
race or creed. That's talking about our faith and our spiritual world.
Good point. Correct. And so, it's complex. And then what would become is even those that are saying, let's stop this, let's come out, come join us, because we're not doing that, well, then that's just doing the same thing. I mean, in a sense. Did you have a question? Or just waving? Okay. Stone's vision of non-denominational Christianity was both sectarian or exclusive and apocalyptic, precisely because he despaired of the values and structures of the present world and stood in judgment on both. He was not an optimist in the sense that Campbell was. He was not a post-millennialist and excited about all the changes and all the progress that society, that culture was making. He viewed it as this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through, and trying to live that way, and was not optimistic in the sense that Campbell was. Different way of looking at it. His vision had far more in common with the growing sectarian emphasis in the early stages of our history than with the ecumenical interests of the later disciples. By the 1830s, many from the ranks of the Stone movement nurtured an apocalyptic and countercultural worldview and began to gravitate toward the sectarian exclusivism of those who had more radicalized the things that Campbell had taught. But to understand these developments more clearly, we need to dig deeper. And so those that followed Stone had a very separatist view, but it was for some different reasons, if you will, than what would develop later. It wasn't just about ideas. It was about this, how you lived. And so Alexander Campbell, as we said, was a post-millennial optimist. He had a progressive spirit in the sense that he saw mankind and culture progressing and improving. There were others that were not of this spirit. Samuel M. McCorkle, in 1833 to 1844, was critical of Campbell's religious and cultural optimism. And Campbell felt he was out of step with the spirit of the age. Okay, by 1844, McCorkle found himself more drawn to Stone's Christian Messenger than Campbell's Millennial Harbinger publications. Stone allowed McCorkle to contribute a lengthy series of articles in the Messenger, which he launched a massive counterattack into Campbell's views. Okay, so what do we have here? We have two different mindsets, two different outlooks that's happening here. And whereas Campbell was embracing these things, these improvements, in a sense, the culture, not the sinful things of it, but these advances, and that there was those like McCorkle that viewed, what are you doing? You should have nothing to do with this. And so these are very powerful, and this shapes and influences how they look at the Scripture. McCorkle writes, great names in the Christian church have vetoed the doctrine of a personal reign of the Messiah, and our credulous brethren following in the perilous wake, half inebriated with the flames of Babylon, are harping upon Christianity restored when we are approaching a time of trouble such as never was. Will they counteract by the ancient order the strong delusion that God has promised to send? Now, that's kind of confusing to us as to what he's writing there. But what he's doing is the Christianity restored was a proclamation that was advanced or made that's saying Campbell and the Restoration Movement had restored the primitive Christianity. And one of his books that he wrote, I think it was The Christian System, I think that was the one, the publisher originally called it Christianity Restored. And so Campbell didn't do that. And then later on, Walter Scott and others did that. And so that's what he's combating. And the mindset of McCorkle and others was things are not going to be restored until Christ comes. Remember, in the post-millennial view, we got to get things right for Christ to come. We got to get things right. And they're saying they're never going to be right until Christ comes. And so that's this deeply embedded foundation as to what's being challenged. And so when he's saying great names, he's talking about Campbell. When he's, and he's saying, if we're saying we've restored this ancient of order, you're being deceived. And so those are some pretty strong things. Scott.
I cannot think of a single place in the Scriptures where it's ever implied that it is our responsibility to make things better so that Christ can come. I cannot think where that would be, yet that thought underlies Campbell's thinking.
Scott said that he can't think of a single place in Scripture that implies that we're supposed to make things better so that Christ will come. And yet, how has that become such a core thing of this post-millennial thinking, as has been labeled by scholars? I think part of it is the culture and the things that have happened are influencing, and the lens through which we look and interpret things is part of the answer. Yes, Scott?
I would hasten to point out it is our responsibility to try to make things better.
Mm-hmm.
But we do so because we're under the reign of the Messiah in the here and the now. He sits upon the throne of the universe in the here and the now. It's not that he's going to come sometime later
Yeah.
and start to reign. He reigns here and now. And he has been making things better over the course of history, though it doesn't seem so at times.
So Scott is saying that the reign of Christ is now, and he has been making things better, though as we look at history, there would be those that might wonder, is, World War II better? Is this better? Is all these things that are going on better? But nonetheless, and so you see these challenges that we have as people, as human beings, on trying to understand and look at this outlook. And so there's those that feel very strongly about it and challenge the different views, and that's okay in doing that. But nonetheless, just trying to get us a flavor. It is significant that McCorkle chose to publish these criticisms in Stone's Christian Messenger, and that Stone agreed to print them. Because isn't that kind of divisive? While Stone did not approve of what McCorkle wrote, he did share McCorkle's pessimistic outlook on human potential and progress. Despite the rejection of Calvinist theories on conversion, Stone and his followers, most of whom were Presbyterian Baptists in background, continued to have basically the Calvinist assessment of human nature. And of course, Calvinism says that we're totally depraved. There's nothing you can do, and so on and so forth. And so even though he's rejected Calvinist views of how one is saved, which we've talked about, those other things lingered. It's interesting, and I'm currently reading Stone's autobiography, and it's just very interesting to me as I'm reading and seeing this kind of pessimistic, if you want to term it that, outlook and assessment of things, because it does come through. And he also has a lot of doubts in himself at various times, and questioning and wondering. So it's just very interesting. And so again, how we view things, how we look at stuff. Stone wrote that mankind are depraved is a lamentable truth, abundantly attested by the Word of God and confirmed by the universal experience and observation. All are in want of what they were made to enjoy, which is God, and had the propensity to satisfy that want with meaner things. In other words, everybody's just out to get, and that self. And we understand some of that all too well ourselves. We all have a doctorate degree in selfishness. Nobody needs to teach us how to be selfish. We're just good at it from the get-go. And so anyhow, in addition, Stone's followers joined in this view the experience of poverty and deprivation. Now, we touched on that when we were looking at Benjamin Franklin. Okay? John Rogers wrote that the pioneers were mostly men of small means who knew nothing of the luxuries and refinements of modern society. Isaac Jones recalled that all the preachers of Middle Tennessee and South Central Kentucky early on were poor men having no homes of their own and having but little education. And so, when we're on this side of this, sometimes it's hard for us to know what that was. But, when the people went west, they took everything they had in a wagon, and they didn't have anything. It was a sense of opportunity. And so when they got there, they still didn't have anything. And they worked and they worked and they worked. I think the life expectancy back then was like 44 or 45 or something like that, the average. Obviously, there were those that lived longer. But I had a teacher that I worked with who read a lot in that subject, and he said they just worked themselves to death. Just worked themselves to death. just trying to stay alive, trying to have something to eat. And that was all a full-time job and shelter and everything else. And yet they did it for opportunity. So, but the point is that out on the frontier, you got people, we didn't have this prominent middle class all over. There might have been a little more of it in the cities, a little bit. But that wasn't until later, really, the economic rise of the middle class on a larger scale, certainly in this country. And so we said our experiences in our life influence how we look at things, how we understand things, because we tend to compare things to our experiences. And that's not wrong, but it often isn't complete, because everybody's experiences aren't the same. Everybody's situation isn't. And so there's going to be that variation. And so challenging things. In Stone's autobiography, I mean, these guys went out and they rode from town to town, and they're just soaking wet. And they sometimes would be gone weeks and months at a time, and just relying on somebody giving them some shelter, somebody feeding them, things like that. And so it was very different times. And so this clearly figures into it. Poverty was hardly unique to the Stone tradition, as we've already presented, that Benjamin Franklin, for example, shared that experience with cultural deprivation, and this was especially true in the South, and certainly after the Civil War, but certainly before. The industrial North had the factories and a higher level and so on and so forth into the South, and poverty was a part of way of life for many in our movement, whoever they followed. B.F. Hall wrote in his autobiography, "We had in those days but few meeting houses. When the weather would allow, we worshipped in groves and under sheds. But as such places were not suitable for preaching in winter, we had to occupy private houses. No one can have any idea of the sacrifices that were made by the veteran pioneers of the present great religious movement. Their adherents were generally of the poorer class and without great personal influence. Preachers were too poor and received but little, how do I say that word? Pecuniary. In other words, they didn't have much money. That had consequently to resort to some spectacular pursuit or secular pursuit in order to make a living." And so it was a very hard and difficult road, and this is what characterized so many and so much in those experiences. And that's authentic, that's real, for sure. And so there were some that made that an almost like this badge of honor. That, in other words, rich man, taking some of the scripture, rich man can't. And so if you have any money, you're in trouble. Now, obviously, we might say there's some scriptural reference to some of that, but those conclusions are just writing off. But as people, we tend to make that leap pretty easily, and wanting to blame for the problems and so on. Deprivation was quite in keeping not only with the outsider mentality of the Stone tradition, but also with the outsider mentality of the Christian Baptists. Okay, remember, us against them. These are the problems, the tearing down, and so on and so forth. At an economic level, the Stone tradition shared as much with the outsider perspective of Campbell and his followers. So in other words, they were very outsider also, for numbers of reasons, but it wasn't going to be on necessarily doctrinal particularities, rather, but on how one lived their lives. But Campbell did not retain the perspective of an outsider for long. It is true that he praised simplicity when he described the ideal building for Christian worship as humble and commodious. And in fact, the building that is in Bethany, across from where Campbell lived, the meeting house there, it's a big brick, I think it was one room, or it wasn't many, and large, and that was it. It was pretty plain. Brush Run, was it? Yeah, and it's just across from his house. where he lived, but got to visit there, and so that was true in how he looked at that, and free from all the splendor of this vain and sinful world. But he never idealized poverty as a Christian virtue, which is what some did. And again, we can see that easy step toward that. And he finally died the wealthiest man in Virginia, according to, I think, Robert Richardson, his biographer. And having plowed inheritance from his father-in-law, I left off the L, into farming, land speculation, book publishing, and educational enterprises. He was a very industrious guy. Scott. So what Scott's saying is that Campbell never took money for his preaching and so on and so forth because he had means, and so he wasn't going to do that. And so again, the wealthiest man in the state of, and the reason it's West Virginia is West Virginia became a state during the Civil War, and Campbell died just a year in 1866 after the war, and so he never considered himself as being a West Virginian. He always said, I'm a Virginian. So interesting. Here is Campbell's house at Bethany. And this was a huge residence at the time. And I can't tell you the square foot or whatever. And I think, I can't remember if the big house was built, I think that was built afterwards. And that Campbell inherited the small. I can't remember the exact details, but it's a pretty good sized structure, as you can see, and it was built between 1795 and 1840. In other words, in those days, you just didn't build it up; you added on over time as you had income. And this farmstead was a home to at least 20 people in family. He had a large family working. And in the early 1840s, visitors were so numerous that 32 chairs often stood ready in the dining room. And I couldn't find a picture of it, but being there, the dining room is very long. And the table was I don't know, 30 feet, 40 feet long. It was huge. Scott.
It was interesting in sections. And as more visitors came,
Just add a section. Okay.
added sections.
Didn't know that. And the reason he had so many visitors is because he was a prominent guy. And it wasn't always about the reform. He had very educated people in there. He had future presidents come and visit him there. Jefferson Davis visited him there. Garfield. Others. It's interesting. Does this mean anything? No, just a little tidbit. The wallpaper he had in there was the exact stuff as Andrew Jackson had in the Hermitage. Now whether that was because, I can't remember how it was imported. And so just very, very interesting. And so anyhow, so this was his home, and this was indeed a mansion at that time. We might consider that, one of the big places in some of the big subdivisions now, but back then that was huge. Now, this is his study. Now, as we were looking at the house, it's over to our left, as I recall, and it's kind of under some trees and so on and so forth. This was this octagonal brick study that he wrote, and so you see the cupola on the top. That's how light got in. And on all the walls are bookshelves. And he had a desk, if you will, that he stood at, and that's where he did his study. And he'd be in there for long periods, and so he had a lot of volumes. You remember, there weren't a lot of public libraries, or there basically weren't. That was a little later on when Carnegie started, paying them and bringing them in later in the century. But having a collection like he had was kind of special on what his books were. And so he was a man of tremendous learning, always wanting to know the latest scientific, farming techniques, all these things. He was broad in what he studied. He just gobbled up knowledge and information. So he was one, and you can see why someone would have the optimism of all the progress and all that was going on, because he's seeing these improvements, these benefits, and so on and so forth. And so it's a mindset. When Campbell often preached in meeting houses, Stone's early preaching is described as largely itinerant, being done under elm and oak and under a beech tree covered with summer grapevine. And while Campbell increasingly moved among the cultured and the sophisticated, the work of Stone and his colleagues remained principally among rustic and unfettered frontier people whose religious practices were often more primitive and emotional. Remember the revivals and all that and so on. So very different kind of overall places they went and people they saw. While initially there was very much economically in common between Stone's followers and the devotees of the Christian Baptists, it came to a point at which the followers of Stone were increasingly separated from what our author calls the maturing Campbell. While Campbell evolved toward a growing accommodation of the American secular and Christian culture, the apocalyptic orientation of Stone and his followers was leading them in decidedly different directions, moving them to reject both worldly values and political activity. And we're going to see that becomes very prominent. Separating from the world and its values was at the heart of Stone's apocalyptic message or vision, and thoughts were expressed in the pages of the Christian Messenger from 1827 to when he died in 1844. Stone consistently urged his follower, didn't we say that? 1844, right? That's when we said he died, right? Yeah.
In fact, he died just after the debate that Campbell had before baptism with Nathan Rice, I believe it was, Lexington.
Okay. Okay. He's name dropping. In another debate, the famous one was with McCalla. Then he had one with a guy named Rice. And the famous politician Henry Clay moderated that debate, is what he's saying that took place. And so remember, he died 22 years before Campbell. He was older. I think he died, he was 70-something. And so Stone consistently urged on his followers a radical code of ethics that required the abandonment of self and service to the neighbor. Stone summoned his followers to avoid extravagant attire, to care for widows and orphans, to minister to the poor and hungry, and to free their slaves. And so he was about how you lived, is what was his focus. Stone wrote in 1842, "No Christian lives for himself, but self, or not self, but the Lord is the great end of his living. Like an obedient servant, he says, 'Lord, what wilt thou have me do?' And when that will is known, he flies to it, not regarding how great the sacrifice of wealth, ease, or reputation." Okay, this idea of great commitment to what's being done. Stone abandoned earlier plans for a law career to take up preaching. Then after he and his dissident friends, the 5 guys who he said were there at Cane Ridge, and then they formed their Springfield Presbytery, and they left the Presbyterian Church after that aftermath, Stone voluntarily relinquished all salary and committed himself to a life of poverty. Because he said he didn't want any control, wants to be able to preach freely. It was part of that thinking. And the idea that, if you're poor, remember, kind of the badge of honor kind of mindset. And so he's kind of practicing that. Having now no support from the congregations and having emancipated my slaves, because he owned slaves, not many, but he had some, he had a farm. He later recalled, I turned my attention cheerfully, though awkwardly, to labor on my little farm. I had no money to hire laborers, and often on my return home, I found the weeds were getting ahead of my corn. And I often had to labor at night while others were asleep to redeem my lost time. And so he was committed to what he had chosen. And so he wasn't a real successful farmer, if you will, partly because he couldn't put the time into it. But he did what he could to survive. Now, it's interesting, on the 5 guys that left and formed the Springfield Presbytery, that I think 2 of them went back to the Presbyterian Church. One of them went, I think, to the Brethren, or the Quakers, or one group, and I can't remember on the other guy. But so they didn't all stick with it. So only Stone, and I think the other fellow, I can't remember his name. Rice Haggard was not part of them. Was not part of those 5. Now he wrote and was, he's involved with that, but he wasn't part of those 5, I don't believe. But anyhow, so it's just very interesting. And in his autobiography, he writes about this, and how how they abandoned, they left, and things like that. Those kind of feelings. 40 years later, he still prized the ideal of an impoverished preacher. Decency in plain, coarse apparel displeases no one but fops and dandies. He wrote, observing, by the way, that we read of no rich preacher in the New Testament, nor the best days of the church, but they were made rich by Constantine when heaven's order was prostrated by that deed. In other words, he's saying God intended preachers to be poor. And when Constantine came in and made a part of the official, and then they got status and richness and so on and so forth, that just kind of destroyed what God wanted in the first place, is basically what he's saying in his thinking. If Stone had a creed, he expressed it in 1841 when he admonished his readers, you must not mind earthly things, nor set your affection on them, not to be conformed to the world. Here you have no abiding place, but are strangers and pilgrims seeking a better country. This sentiment was the essence of apocalyptic worldview expressed by Stone. Now, as we look at this, do we embrace this? I would say no. At least in the sense that it's manifested, that he's talking about it with the economic deprivation and so on and so forth. We don't. Not saying we should, just bringing out questions, that he was really committed to that as being a righteous way of living and not being corrupted and so on and so forth. And so we can see that these biases, not saying he's a loving guy and everything else, but the way we view things influence how we look at things. And so, but anyhow, so just a very fascinating guy who lived what he preached. I mean, he strived to do that as far as we're able to as people. We all know none of us are totally consistent. And so all this stands in remarkable contrast to what Martha Wilson, a mountain girl from North Carolina, found at Campbell's Bethany College in 1858 when she went there. Now, this is some years after Stone's gone, obviously. And she writes that having accompanied her husband to Bethany, Martha wrote home to her aunt that she and her husband had invitations to tea at Mr. Campbell's and most of the professors. They were all very sociable and friendly, but there were more grades and circles in society than I think ought to be in the Christian community. In other words, it was very culturally different. This was a very educated community up there at Bethany, and obviously probably a higher economic circle, certainly than Stone and them ran in. And so they're embracing that. Now, some would say that was awful and terrible, and others, not. But the point is, our culture can affect us. Not saying that's wrong or terrible or anything like that, but just it was very different. And this girl was certainly not used to that. And so they were seeing these social divisions, just like there often is in that, in those economic levels. And so she's seeing that. Here's a picture of Bethany. This is called Old Main, or I don't know if all of them are, certainly the big tower, but this exists today. There's more on the campus than just this, but that original structure is still there. And so at the time, that was a pretty decent place. In another letter she wrote, "I do not like to visit here. The people visit too fashionably." But her husband was awed with the prospects of Bethany graduates. Tell Uncle that a great many of the young men go out from college to teach, but owing to the reputation of Bethany for its instruction, they command enormous prices, never less than $800. One young preacher has been offered $1,500 in South Virginia to preach for 3 churches. I think that's yearly income. Now we'd look, that doesn't pay for an oil change today, but almost. But we can see that these views were coming into a culture clash, and it's important to realize that without a doubt, differences in orientation toward the world clearly separated the basic worldviews of Stone and Campbell. The theme of separation from the world and its values continued to be a powerful motif among the churches of Christ well into the 20th century as we look into that. And we will stop here, perfect stopping place, and we're going to look into next week this idea of why you don't vote, why you don't get into politics, that aspect of it. Now, we look at that and we go, what? Well, we're many decades on that side of that argument, which kind of in World War I and certainly by World War II wasn't 100% wiped out, but it had become almost nominal within our fellowship. There was a change that took place, and we'll take some look at that. Thank you very much.